As journalists, I know whether we're covering Congress, the Department of Labor, the Interior, the best that we can expect are relations based on respect and mutual trust. Nobody's giving away the keys to the kingdom. I think we all know that and appreciate that. But for years, George Little, our guest, was the face of two of the most demanding assignments in Washington, the CIA and the Pentagon. Ultimately serving 3 defense secretaries, is that right?
2 that I recall.
2? Okay.
But two directors of CIA.
Didn't want to add more to your time. George's terms coincided with the deadly raid on Osama bin Laden's Pakistani hideout and the long wind down of the Iraqi war. We didn't always get what we wanted, but George's respect for our mission always resonated, offering up these important words from Thomas Jefferson when he left government. You rarely hear somebody, especially who's director of press operations, utter words like these when he left. But I quote, "The only security of all is in a free press. The force of public opinion cannot be resisted when permitted freely to be expressed. The agitation it produces must be submitted to. It is necessary to keep the waters pure." So with that, I'll turn it over to George, who has some words about relationship building.
Kevin, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You are learning from one of the best. Kevin has had a tremendous career here in Washington, covering justice and other topics. And it's a real pleasure to be back with you, Kevin. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I am delighted to be here to share my thoughts on what life is like in DC, especially at CIA and at the Pentagon with respect to press operations and the relationship between public affairs officers, spokespeople, and the press corps. And look forward to your open questions and back and forth. So I'll share a few observations maybe, and then we can go from there. I should preface all of this by saying that I had absolutely zero training when I became a spokesperson for the CIA. I started out in life as a budding college professor. I did my PhD at Georgetown in international relations. Eventually went to Booz Allen and IBM doing corporate strategy consulting for a number of years. Ended up at the National Counterterrorism Center where I did some counterterrorism work shortly after 9/11. And then was kind of randomly asked actually by Mike Hayden, who was director of CIA at the time, not quite sure how he found out about me, to become CIA spokesman. And I said, "Sir, you do realize that I've never spoken to a reporter in my life, and how am I possibly going to be successful in this job, and why do you want me?" I went home that night, and my wife arched her eyebrows at me and said, "Do they know how candid you can be?" And can you really say anything as CIA spokesman in any case? It turns out you can. So this was frankly an accidental profession for me, but one that I have come to greatly value and respect. And Kevin, thank you for reminding me of my parting message when I left the Pentagon. I truly do believe that the role that the press plays in our system is foundational and essential. And I always thought that even during the tough moments when I was in government. I'm happy to share any and all thoughts and observations. I'm a pretty honest guy. So feel free to pepper me with questions, and I know how to deflect if I need to. So, as I said, I came to CIA thinking that I would be fired relatively quickly in this job. I asked why they wanted someone like me to become their spokesman, and I think it was really for a couple of reasons that I quickly learned. One is, I mean, there's obviously the relatability thing and approachability, rapport. That's important. Blah, 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 blah. We all know that. That's any job anywhere, right? But I think also, I think they sensed in me a little bit of my professorial bent in that I really like to educate and inform and go deep sometimes on the issues. And that's actually what I found at CIA. It's not always about issuing the quote. It's not always about trying to spin. I hate that term. It's really about the press corps and government public affairs officers like me to try to get the information right and to try to shape stories. I don't mean that in the spin way, but to inform stories in a way that will be additive to the stories that you all are telling. Whether it was on arcane issues of, demographics in a particular country, or if it was on Al-Qaeda at the time, or Iraq or Afghanistan or what have you, I really felt that my first and foremost duty with the press corps was to help inform and to educate. Not that I was an expert on everything, but I had vast resources to bring to bear within CIA, because CIA is actually one of the preeminent knowledge centers in the world on just about every topic you can think of when it comes to national security and foreign affairs. An incredible reservoir of information. So on the one hand, I saw my job as to inform. In other cases, I saw my job as to protect, especially when it came to classified information. There's classified information, and there is classified information. It's not all, too much is classified these days. We can talk about that later. But sensitive operations, when lives were at stake, I really felt a heavy burden early on to help protect lives, whether it was the lives of CIA officers or our assets, those who we recruit to work against their own countries to provide us information and to keep us safe. If it were at the Pentagon dealing with sensitive military operations and so forth. During the Bin Laden raid, I spent about 10 months of my life, that's why I have a lot of gray hair and a lot less of it, planning for that raid and worrying about a leak for a number of months. Never happened, thank goodness, but I was prepared to deal with reporters and to make some deals if it had. And I honestly believe at the end of the day that no one would have dimed out that particular raid and allowed Osama bin Laden to get away. But anyway, there were times that were quite difficult. There were controversial issues that I was facing, especially at CIA when I was there. That was the era of enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, that whole conversation. That was a tough one for me, I'll be honest. On a personal level, that's not where I tend to go from a policy perspective. But I also remembered at the time that, and was reminded on a daily basis, that this was deemed lawful by the Department of Justice. It was approved by policymakers. And it was deemed at the time, we can have a discussion about it, to be effective. So I didn't feel like it was my job, and it really isn't the job of CIA to defend policy or even to shape it. To inform it, yes, but not to define it or necessarily always to challenge it. I felt a little bit of a struggle on that one, but I came to terms with the fact that I was defending individual CIA officers, never CIA agents, by the way. CIA agents are those who you recruit. So CIA officers, the movies often get it wrong. But my job was to defend CIA officers who thought they were doing the right thing for their agency, their country, and the mission. The CIA role I did for about 4.5 years, and it was outstanding. I really enjoyed it. It was a really team-oriented atmosphere, had a great press corps. There's not a resident press corps at CIA, as you might imagine, as there is at the Pentagon, which you've seen. But I really found the press corps at CIA, the core beat of national security reporters and columnists who cover national security issues really did rely on the agency historically, long before I came, to help inform stories, wave reporters off bum scoops, all of that stuff. So it was the David Ignatius of the world and the some terrific USA Today reporters and Andrea Mitchell and Mark Mazzetti at the Times, and these really terrific, accomplished national security and defense reporters who relied on the agency for information, or at least to steer. And what I found is that over time, I feel like, Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong, because we work together a little bit, that sense of trust is so critical. And I felt like the most successful thing I did as a spokesman was build trust with reporters. I wasn't always right necessarily. I wasn't always 100% on the mark, and I didn't always, bat 1,000. I'm human, but I felt like in the main, I really tried to maintain that level of trust and rapport and relationship. I personally never declined, even if it was a really tough outlet that we were dealing with at the time. Someone wanted to go have coffee, I'd do it. Someone wanted to go have a meeting, I'd do it. Couldn't always line up the exact backgrounder someone wanted to have with a clandestine CIA officer, but I would try to engage as much as I possibly could, even when I was relatively removed physically from the press corps. 3 days before the Bin Laden raid, my boss at the time, Leon Panetta, was nominated to become Secretary of Defense. And I said, why would they, and he was CIA director at the time. I said, well, why would they possibly nominate you now? Because if this thing goes wrong on Sunday, this weekend with bin Laden, are they really going to want to put your name forward? But anyway, all went well. He was nominated, and he, in a large meeting of fellow CIA officers, voluntold me that I would be the Pentagon press secretary when he became Secretary of Defense. So this was a job that I never expected, debated somewhat whether I should take, but ended up following my boss over to the five-sided building. And this is a much different role. This is the only Ministry of Defense in the world that has a resident press corps. Reporters are free to roam around the building, really wherever. I mean, there are some areas that are classified and so forth, but there is pretty much unfettered access, whether it's in the hallways of the E-Ring, around the Secretary's office, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You see people in the food court all the time. The DoD budget is always something that reporters are interested in, and I used to see reporters hanging around the DoD budget office a lot. It is pretty remarkable, and it's something that I have great respect for. My office was, well, you probably saw it right outside the briefing room. And that was a bit of an adjustment for me, just because I was having 3D interactions with reporters every day. I will tell you, though, that just to kind of fast forward to the bottom line, I found the Pentagon Press Corps to be an amazing group of people focused on telling stories with analytical foundation, informed by facts and the truth. They really tried to get it right. It was not a very political press corps at all. And I really feel like it's the best press corps in Washington of those that cover major podiums. I think the White House could be a little politically fraught for obvious reasons. There's not unfettered access to the White House grounds, right? The State Department doesn't have unfettered access. That can sometimes be dicey too. Personally, I think the Pentagon Press Corps is an amazing group of people in the main. We did have issues. We did have our conversations from time to time. We had a lot of non-versations, but really an amazing group of people. And to have the chance to interact on a daily basis, I think helped build trust and engagement, in a sense that we were in this together, not that we were doing the same thing, but that we were trying to achieve, to some degree, a common goal. The other thing that I realized pretty quickly off the bat with the Pentagon was the secretary flies around on a regular basis, visiting 6 countries in 12 time zones in 6 days, kinds of things. On the E-4B, the so-called doomsday plane, it's actually, when it's not flying the secretary around, as a nuclear command platform for the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others to make decisions in the midst of a nuclear war. Hopefully that never happens. But we would fly around on this plane, and we would also bring up to 18 journalists, print, TV, radio, you name it. And you really developed a very close bond in very close quarters, traveling hours and hours on a plane, in a small tube with reporters, and we would have on, camera on the plane briefings with the secretary. We would do background briefings. We had the occasional announcement. I think I have the record for the most emergency press gaggles on Secretary of Defense overseas trips, because every time we took off somewhere, some crisis immediately hit. So it was a bit of a curse, whether it was something happening with Afghanistan or an investigation into a senior official. That happened once or twice when we were traveling. Trouble always seemed to follow us. But that was an amazing experience as well. And I think that's something that's actually cherished by the press corps too. When you're able to travel around and kind of follow the Secretary of Defense, whether it's into a war zone or to an important capital where diplomatic discussions are going on, or you're visiting the troops somewhere, it gives you a real sense. I guess the bottom line for me is at the Pentagon, I just think it's a remarkable testament to our system of government that we, A, allow it, that we, B, attempt to enable the kind of reporting that we do on these issues. And remember, the Pentagon is not just about the military and missiles and tanks and whatever and war. It's also a healthcare system. There's a justice system. There's a school system. There's so much to cover inside this building, where I would tell my bosses there, Secretary Hagel and Secretary Panetta, when I worked for both, you're basically the governor of a state. You're running all of this and a military. 3 million people or so, give or take, 1%-ish of the American population works for the Secretary of Defense. So that's a big job. And when I would remind Secretary Hagel of that, he would reply in characteristic, colorful form, especially when I reminded him that that was basically twice the size of his home state of Nebraska. But anyway, you develop, a real rapport on these trips. So I found my experience with reporters over time to be deeply rewarding because I felt like we were serving common cause. We were on separate sides sometimes. There were times when I had to make a tough request. I had very little recourse as a spokesman except moral suasion, maybe, and to make an argument to say, hey, look, can we hold off on printing that or at least that detail? I didn't do it very often, but I felt like there were times when I had to go to the mat and, for whatever reason, asked to hold or not to print for a while. That included, now it's all reported, case closed. I'm not violating any non-disclosures agreement that I have with the U.S. government. But the case of Bob Levinson, who it turns out was hired by CIA to do some sleuthing, inappropriately so by the CIA, I should say, sleuthing in Iran, went missing for many, many years. And there were a couple of reporters who, frankly, had that story early on about Bob Levinson. And we made the case that printing anything, especially in that context with the Iranians, could be potentially detrimental to him. We believe that he's probably no longer living. That was always something that lurked over me. There were some operations that people caught wind of rather early on, and I made the case and was successful. I think in part because, I think the facts were there to make the case, but also I think because of trust building that I had with certain reporters. I didn't always win. There were certain details of sensitive sources and methods after the bin Laden raid that I asked Washington Post and others not to publish. I was denied. You don't bat 1,000, and that's okay. But I always felt like for the most part, I got a fair hearing. And that's all that you want as reporters, and that's all that we want as government spokespeople too. If we can have civil dialogue, we're going to have disagreements, but we don't have to be adversarial at the outset. And if we are able to engage, which is something tough to do in a polarized America these days, if we can help each other inform the American people, respecting the fact that there are certain divergences in our mission, then I think we all flourish and we're all better for it. I guess I should just maybe conclude my opening remarks. I hope I haven't gone on too long, Kevin.
No, not at all. It's probably a good time to open it up.
Yeah.
Who's up?
I'm happy to talk about the bin Laden raid in particular if anyone wants to chat about that.
That sounds like I should say, Aneri Patani with KFF Health News. That sounds like way more interesting than my question for you.
No, it's all good.
But no, you mentioned just as a spokesperson being really open to getting coffee with people or meetings. I have found that to be difficult. I'm newer to DC. I also came here post-COVID.
Yeah.
And I realized, press secretaries are pressed for time, and it's hard to say like, hey, I don't have a particular story right now. I know I'm going to keep coming to you on this beat, and so I want to grab coffee with you. And it hasn't happened for some of the things that I want. So I'm curious what tips you have or insight into kind of building that relationship when people are really busy.
Yeah, it is hard. And first of all, it's a mistake on the part of whoever you're dealing with. I won't ask names or agency.
I won't throw them under the bus because I'm trying to build that relationship.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think sometimes you can rely on your colleagues at your. I'm sorry, I can't see your organization.
KFF Health News.
Okay. So maybe the others know them, and you can do a group coffee. Pulling other people in always helps. Showing up where they're going to be at a certain event, or likely to be, and just to make the face-to-face contact can be really helpful. I really don't mind. Maybe others do. A little bit of digital, kind of messaging as well. So I think there are different ways. You don't want to overdo it, right, and pester and so forth, right? But keep at it. Get that first coffee is my recommendation. I think it's silly that it hasn't happened yet.
I will use that in my next email to them.
Okay, yeah. You can quote me on that. Yeah, I just had a different approach.
Hi, this is Diego from Bloomberg.
I've heard of Bloomberg.
Yes. So going back to what you were talking about at the time you were at the CIA, I'm curious about that struggle you said you had the CIA has a lot of stigma. I would just put it that way around it. It's not a well-seen organization around
Right.
the world. What it's like to work with them and have to defend these issues that, some are calling human rights violations or extreme espionage, privacy invasions, and so on and so forth. And what it's like to talk to your bosses, be the CIA director or the defense secretary, and tell them, I need to know about this to be prepared to any questions that may come up or any reporting that may come up.
Great questions. So let me take the second one first, and then I'll go back to the first one, which was a very good question as well. I really didn't have any trouble getting access to information. I read the President's daily brief. I was in on the CIA director's daily staff meetings. I was on the leadership team. I knew generally what was happening. I didn't know everything, of course, but anything of consequence that might have some public ramifications, I was brought into relatively early on. And if I heard about something from a reporter and needed to chase it down, then I would get an instant call back from whoever I needed to hear from, and I would get the straight scoop. In fact, I made it not a condition of my employment, because you can't really make it, but when I went to the CIA, I said, look, I'm not going to just take someone else's talking points and assume it's true. I'm going to do my own internal reporting and make sure we have the facts in the right place, because it's my credibility on the line, right? Not just the credibility of the institution. And I'm not going to put myself out there unless I have access to the director's thinking or to the facts within the Counterterrorism Center or on cybersecurity or what have you. So I found it to be actually, in a weird way, a remarkably open place. And what I found about CIA, just to focus there for a second, is that there really are two twin imperatives of the agency, right? Openness in a democracy and secrecy by virtue of the mission. And there's actually a lot that CIA can share, because as long as it doesn't involve sources and methods, but it involves our analysis or our thinking on certain issues, whether it's Afghanistan or Iran or North Korea, as long as you're not diming out sources and methods, you can actually say a lot. So, it's not like it's all secret squirrel stuff. And I think that the smart reporters in national security, have figured that out. And they actually get a lot out of the agency that's not somehow violating, agency policy or classified information. The first question, it's a good one, and I think that a lot of, you're never going to agree totally as a human being with everything your agency does, probably, whether you're at the Pentagon or CIA or HHS or someplace else, right? That is, something that you have to wrestle with. For me, it was about defending the officers of the agency and about not about defending the policy. Now, that's how I squared it in my own mind. Whenever I might have disagreed personally, you're right about there's no natural political constituency for the CIA, right? The Pentagon, yes. The Pentagon has lots of people who've served in the military. There are lots of bases around the country. Lots of jobs outside the military are attached. There are several 100,000 civilian jobs within the military. There's the defense industrial base. There is political constituency for the Pentagon. It is over $800 billion now of our federal budget on an annual basis. That doesn't really exist for CIA. There aren't really public CIA bases, anywhere around the world, maybe Langley and a couple of other places. But it's not a visible institution, and there's a little mythology around it. There are movies that go haywire about CIA, right? The CIA historian I worked with used to talk about his analysis of movies and say, we're either portrayed as evil and omnipotent or incompetent dolts. And I think that's kind of true, right? And the Jason Bournes of the world really don't exist, to my knowledge. Don't tell anyone. It's a nice kind of mythology to perpetuate. But most of what the agency does, 99.999% of what the agency does, I really believe this, 99% of Americans would agree with. It's collecting intelligence. It's analyzing. It's trying to work with NSA and others on cyber. It's trying to defeat illegal narcotics flows, through the Southern Cone and so forth. I think if we could open the door a little bit more to what CIA does, I think most Americans would say, yeah, do it. When it gets a little bit of chalk dust on its cleats and crosses the line maybe, or touches the line, that's where it gets dicey. And that's where the political controversy and even scandal can sometimes creep in. And the enhanced interrogation program certainly created that for the agency when I was there. It was a problem broadly because I think in 2007 it was officially declared, although it had been reported earlier. There was a system of secret prisons. And then there was the kind of aftermath in Congress. The agency contended that members of Congress had been briefed early on about it, and members of Congress said, no, we weren't. So there was that food fight. So it got dicey from a national security perspective, from a congressional perspective. Nancy Pelosi was calling us liars. I had to go out there without consulting my boss because he was in a meeting somewhere and say, we're not liars, and push back against Nancy Pelosi. That's never a fun place for a spokesman to have to be. So anyway, it worked out. I ended up surviving to the next day. Didn't get fired, but it's tough. You really do feel like the stakes are high. You know that you're not always going to get political backing, especially at CIA, and you have to steel yourself for it.
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm with the Nevada Independent.
Oh, terrific.
You mentioned working for, I think, 2 different secretaries of defense.
Yes.
And I'm always curious with press people how much of a press shop is like a spokesman style versus top down from the principal.
Great.
And so what were the biggest changes going between secretaries of defense in terms of how you communicated with the press or your day-to-day?
That's a great question. Yes, you're absolutely right. Each principal, is a secretary or a director of an agency, department or agency director, has their own style, and some are frankly more comfortable with press engagement than others. Some are more comfortable with public speaking than others. I found some remarkable similarities overall between Secretary Panetta and Hagel. They're both, esteemed public servants. They they were both served in the military. Hagel was the first, enlisted combat veteran to ever serve as Secretary of Defense. And they had remarkably different perspectives. Similar perspectives on the press corps and its role in society. Secretary Panetta had a much more kind of comfortable style with the press corps, and he was willing to have backgrounders and off-the-record dinners, and we'd have anytime I wanted to deploy him, I pretty much could within reason, and I think that earned him a lot of respect. I think that Secretary Hagel was very good with the press too, but was a little concerned, not about the press necessarily, but about running afoul of the White House, because you're in these positions not just representing the Pentagon, but also the president that you serve. So that's a struggle sometimes that I think is real. And I think there were some developments early on in Secretary Hagel's tenure that I could understand why he wanted to be a little bit more hands-off. So not a major difference, but I would say that was the main difference that I probably noticed, was just a little bit more natural engagement from my first boss at the Pentagon, and a willingness to do so from Secretary Hagel, but in a more guarded way. And I think, look, the press corps can sense that. You're flying around together, you're talking to staff together. And don't get me wrong, the press corps really liked Secretary Hagel. He had a flair for really funky socks in particular, which got some reporting. I'm like, what are you wearing, sir? And, there is each secretary and his or her team, has a different kind of style, and the press corps has to ebb and flow with it. But I do think it helped Secretary Hagel. This is going to sound self-congratulatory, and I don't mean it to be that way, but I do think there was something about continuity of press secretaries between the two that was helpful for what it's worth. And not just me, but the entire team. I think a lot of us stayed from Secretary Panetta to Hagel and were able to I think, provide some degree of continuity with the press corps.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a freelancer, so work with lots of places. Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
We've been talking a lot in these conversations about changes in the media industry more broadly, consolidation,
Yes.
lack of resources, economic changes, all of that. I'd love to hear your perspective on something else that we've noticed, which is sort of more independent media, individual journalists, TikTokers, those sorts of things that are serving and liaising with official government agencies much more than they probably were in your day.
Yeah. Back
Probably
in my
not, probably not on the defense side as much as like, the White House hosting influencer summits and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But is that something you've noticed at all just as an onlooker now? And how do you feel like that interacts when you don't have the institutional knowledge that CBS News or somebody brings?
So many changes in the press corps. I mean, I don't need to tell this group, you know better than I do, and certainly Kevin can, provide much more context on this than I can. But I noticed that even when I was in government, the business of journalism was changing, was becoming tougher. DC bureaus were shutting down. It was a tough time, and reporters were now not just covering a building, but they were covering multiple buildings. Whereas once you might cover CIA, now it was CIA and DHS and NSA and whatever. That was a real challenge, I think, for a lot of the reporters I worked with, and I felt, some degree of sympathy for them along the way. The analog to TikTok back in my day was blogs. Kind of the blogosphere was starting to emerge at the time I was in government, and I think there was a strategic question for us as to whether or not to engage. Should we just be engaging with the wires and NBC, or should we engage also with this new form of journalism, if it can be classified as new? We made a decision to do so, to engage with bloggers, and we started to monitor Twitter, because what we found was sometimes these blogs or tweets were becoming tip sheets for more mainstream outlets. I would send a statement to anybody who wanted it. I would have coffee with bloggers. I'm not sure that's always possible these days with so many more independent, self-proclaimed journalists, on TikTok and elsewhere. But we made a conscious decision to treat everyone more or less similarly. Now, I'm not going to say the New York Times is always, seen as the same level as some blogs and what have you, but we tried to be engaging even with the blogs at that time. So I think it's important for government agencies to engage with new media. That's the reality of it.
Sorry, just to follow up, do you think the TikTok national security aspect impacts that conversation at all?
TikTok in China and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, there's conversations about banning the use of the app. I think the DoD does ban the use of the app for employees.
Right. And how does that have an effect on engaging with TikTok?
Yeah.
So there's engaging on the platform, and there's engaging with people on the platform. Does that make sense? And so even if you're not engaging on TikTok, maybe there's a way to engage with the TikToker. Is that the right term? I'm getting really old. But you know what I mean? So it's you have to still be conscious of it, right? I mean, even though I'm not going to ban myself from looking at TikTok if something about DoD is being, now I may not be able to use it on my government computer, but I'm going to figure out a way to learn what's on it, because you have to understand what's happening out there. And sometimes it may be appropriate to engage.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm with NPR. I would like to take you up on your offer to talk about the Bin Laden raid.
Okay.
Whatever you want to share, but one of my specific questions is sort of about the period where you knew more than lots of other people, and you said you were worried about leaks and prepared to make deals.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that in that particular case and how
Sure.
it compared to your process and worries and precautions and lots of other big stories that I'm sure you dealt with during your tenure.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I'll just kind of start with, I won't bore you with 30 minutes on the Bin Laden raid, but I'll kind of work through it. Okay. So several months before the raid itself, I was in a leadership meeting, regular 8 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. meeting with the director and a senior team, including the head of the clandestine service and the head of the counterterrorism center, et cetera. And I heard someone casually mention, the A1 thing. And there was some conversation about it. I sensed that it was important in some way, shape, or form. And a couple of days later, I went into the director's office and I said, A1? He's like, yeah, that's Bin Laden. I'm like, wait a minute. Abbottabad 1. That was the kind of original code name for the Abbottabad compound. I was briefed in shortly thereafter, and I went back into Director Panetta afterwards and I said, look, I know I'm stating the obvious here, but if we go after Bin Laden, And if it's success, great, or it doesn't succeed, this is going to make news. So it's going to be a headline. So we need a plan for this. We need a communications plan that will account for success or failure. So he said, yes, go off and do it. The lawyers actually delayed that for a while because it's kind of ridiculous, but they said you can't technically plan a public affairs rollout for a Title 50 covert operation, which is legally deniable. And I said, well, this is not going to be deniable at the end of the day. Is there some way we can reach a compromise here? So we called it a contingency public affairs plan. Anyway, 2 weeks later, I brought in one of my team members and I told them that I would absolutely fire them just before I resigned if they ever said anything about this. And we started to build out the framework of a communications plan. And we started to get in the flow of the daily or routine, not always daily, but routine meetings with the team that was running the bin Laden raid operation, with some of the military special operators who were at CIA, squirreled away in a kind of hidden place on the complex, working with them because there was obviously the military aspect of the raid as well. And so we spent months really preparing a package of materials. At the end of the day, it was 66 pages long, 33 pages for success, 33 for complete unadulterated failure. And people along the way would ask me, well, what does failure look like? And I said, failure is failure. Whether it's a helicopter having a malfunction, which did happen, by the way, during the raid, all's well that ends well, but it did happen. Or the Pakistanis, come out and start shooting at us, because after all, it is the Pakistani West Point, that town. So many other contingencies that could have happened. I said, I can't plan for all of them. I just know it's going to be failure. So we decided to just plan for success. It's him. Or, by the way, failure could have been, it actually was another tall guy. It was an Omani banker or something who happened to be living in Abbottabad, right? Because we weren't sure until the very end, until that day, until we could lay eyes on that it was Osama bin Laden. It was all kind of a circumstantial case, a pretty damn good one, but circumstantial until the day of the raid. So, I really felt like the stakes were high. And I said, well, who in the White House can I talk to about this? Another communicator? Nope. I said, really? Okay. George, you're going to build this plan with your team, and, eventually we'll get the White House involved, but let's not do that for now, to keep the circle really, really tight. I said, fine. So I would track, what the intelligence case was. I would track what the military was doing to plan, and they did some amazing things to kind of practice, on certain bases around the country without making it look they were trying to raid an Al-Qaeda compound somewhere in Abbottabad. They did an amazing job, and all credit to America's military for success at the end of the day. The CIA was in charge of this operation because it was Title 50. So the director of CIA was technically the commander of the operation and reported directly to the president on it. With military operations, obviously, that's a little bit different. In any case, as we got closer and closer to May 1st of 2011, the day of the raid, first of all, I was not very popular at home because I was spending a lot of time at the office. Had to come up with a little bit of a cover story for why I was not showing up for family events and my toddler's school, events. And I told my wife truthfully that I was helping to prepare then Director Panetta for his nomination process for Secretary of Defense. That's true. In any case, I think that one of the most stressful moments for me was kind of the last week of the run-up to the raid, because we were getting close, number one. It was almost game time. And the circle was widening, and I was really worried that it would spill out in some way, shape, or form. The circle in CIA had grown, but also a little bit larger at the White House and a few more people at the Pentagon. Ultimately, that people did keep it under wraps, thank goodness, but I was really, really worried. I tried to keep kind of business as usual throughout that week. Like I said, a few days before the raid, he was nominated to become Secretary of Defense. I was finally authorized to go to the White House and brief Ben Rhodes on the operation. I first briefed him, I think, on that Thursday, and went down and we had a relatively short meeting, and he said, oh, this is a big one. I said, yes, it is, Ben. And then I went back on Saturday before the raid, which was on a Saturday morning, to brief a team more fully on it. And I'll never forget this. I drove myself from Langley. I drove my really beat up Hyundai Santa Fe or whatever, parked it on G Street, walked the Secret Service guard gate at the White House with a lock bag full of the entire bin Laden raid mission, documents. That was also the day of the White House Correspondents' Dinner that night. And this was a whole strategy session in and of itself. How are we going to handle the White House Correspondents' Dinner? And I was, Secretary Director Panetta and I were invited to be at the Wall Street Journal table. And there were certain people like, well, should we go that night? Should we not? Blah, blah, blah. I've said, everyone's going. We have to look like this is BAU here, And so we went, and knowing my boss, Secretary Panetta, I was really worried that he, he's a pretty forthcoming guy. I was really worried that he'd say something, but he didn't. And I had brought some team members in to read them in, the speechwriter at CIA and others. Just on a personal note, I'm sharing this for no particular reason, except just it's a vivid memory. One of my very close friends, a cousin, died in Kenneth Fitzgerald, 104th floor of the World Trade Center. And I had kept a memorial booklet from his funeral service, that had a whole book of poems that people had read for him. And I handed it to the speechwriter, and I said, I want you to use this as inspiration if you want to, because today's a big day. In any case, around 1:15 or so in the afternoon, we were getting close to go time. And I walked into the director's conference room, which was made into a makeshift operations center for the raid, video screens, and it looked like how you envision the Situation Room, right? And he was, at that point, in there by himself. I took one of my staffers who I brought in that day, and he was having a very casual conversation on video screen with Bill McRaven, who was the admiral in charge of the military operation. He was sitting in Afghanistan, and they were kind of laughing and going back and forth. I'm thinking to myself, this is a pretty serious day, right? But I think they were both just trying to keep each other calm, cool, and collected. I'll never forget a big, 7-Eleven Diet Coke or something that was right on McRaven's desk, big honkin' soda. In any case, all of a sudden, my boss, at 1:20 that afternoon, suddenly gets very serious and says, "Okay, Bill, let's have a real conversation here." And he pulls out a piece of paper and he says, "I am now conveying the order of the President of the United States to commence this operation." And that's when it really hit me that this was really happening. The adrenaline was like, okay, here we are. I turned to my staffer and I said, "Could you please write this time down? Because we're going to remember this." So shortly thereafter, the leadership team and some other intelligence community leaders assembled in the operations room, and we monitored the operation as it played out. And there were some tough moments. There was a helicopter accident. Eventually the team on the ground decided to blow it up. They couldn't go with plan A in terms of where they wanted to land. They had to go to a plan B. The military professionals on this were absolutely unbelievable. We could tell more or less real time that they were getting women and children, away out of the compound. We were monitoring kind of social media. And one thing we actually, I think, got a little bit wrong about the whole thing was people were live tweeting this stuff that was happening at this compound from nearby residential rooftops. And we had a team that was actually showing us in real time what Pakistanis living in Abbottabad were reporting, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'm not sure we had fully accounted for real-time social media. In any case, for about 30 or 40 minutes while the team was on the ground, we monitored things. I remember at one point, one of the military guys, because we were monitoring their chat, Geronimo EKIA. And we all looked at each other. Geronimo EKIA, what does that mean? And it turns out that was a military code name for bin Laden and estimated to be killed in action, EKIA. And then we got the Geronimo KIA confirmation. We didn't really breathe a sigh of relief until our men and women in uniform departed Pakistani airspace safely and we're back in Afghanistan, because there was a real risk of Pakistanis getting into a firefight with us. There's some invading force here. We don't know who they are. Is it the Iranians? Is it somebody else? And we were very, very concerned about that. All's well that ends well when it comes to the military operation. The mood in the room was not one of like high-fiving and fist bumps. It was just kind of quiet relief, I think, that there were hugs in the room and so forth, but it was not a festive kind of atmosphere. After all, this is, no one likes to have to engage in this kind of activity necessarily. We were killing a few people that evening. And then, once that was done, some of us went down to the White House and, okay, what the hell do we do next? Right? We know this is going to become public soon. We're going to have to go out with it at some point. How do we notify our allies and partners and the Pakistanis? By the way, there was a whole rollout for that. Who's going to be called first and how and when and by whom. Pakistanis were called first. And one of the biggest issues that night for us from a public affairs perspective was, when are we going to go out? And I was advocating for like right away, because I knew we were calling Congress that night. And Congress is the biggest, leak machine in the world. And it's bin Laden, right? So I knew it was going to come out at some point. There was some thinking, including by very senior government officials, that maybe we could wait until Monday. It was Sunday night. I'm like, no, this is different. This is not something that can hold. We almost got there, but it finally leaked from Congress at some point on TV. Everyone was speculating that night. Is it Gaddafi? Is it something else? Is it, why is President Obama coming out to speak on a Sunday night? But eventually, of course, he did. And we had written the initial statement. The White House, of course, drafted it more for Obama's own voice, but that was our at least initial draft. And then it was kind of off to the races. And I'll talk a little bit now about just some of the media lessons learned that I found out after the raid. I'll just tell one final story from that night. We were leaving around 12:30 or 1. Panetta and his chief of staff and I were leaving the West Wing. The following was not about us because there was construction going on at the time. So we were not visible to the crowds that had assembled in front of the White House in celebration of the news. And at the very moment we were leaving, they started chanting CIA, CIA, CIA randomly. And I turned to my boss and I said, "Sir, I don't know whether to smile or run, because when large crowds are chanting CIA, that's not usually a good sign." So we're off to the races, and obviously a big feeding frenzy and so forth. I think we got a few things right and a few things wrong, probably. And you can't necessarily control everything in a big moment like this, but if we had waited a little bit to get more information and confirmation from the operators on the ground, on the certain details of the operation, because people were fighting over every detail, right? Were there head cams? Could you see bin Laden? There was some false reporting on that. And was there a firefight or not, or what have you? And I think if we had taken our time to develop a confirmed set of facts that we were all aligned on and that were true, of course, then I think that could have been a little bit more helpful along the way. We couldn't possibly brief everyone in advance because we made the decision to keep the circle relatively tight on the mission itself. But there was so much desire to get information out there from various departments and agencies that I think, that was something that was a lesson learned. It didn't help necessarily, and created some moments that we didn't need. So things we got right, and Kevin and I were talking about this because the Saturday after the raid, we had found some materials there, including videos from the compound and other really valuable intelligence. And we were really concerned at that point, not just about, filling in the details on the raid, but also confirming that it was actually bin Laden. We were deeply concerned within the agency that there would be people out there in the world, Americans or enemies or whoever, that would think this hadn't happened. Now, eventually Al-Qaeda itself confirmed it, but we were like, well, should we show the photos? What about the death photos of bin Laden? I mean, I had them in my desk, and I frankly was one person who advocated for it, thinking that it would help with the confirmation of the raid, because it was clearly bin Laden. I mean, it's a bit of a gruesome photo, but it's clearly Osama bin Laden. I think the government actually, the White House, the president made the right decision at the end of the day, because we had enough information otherwise to confirm that it was him. And it might have led to an accusation that we were spiking the football. And it might have seemed a little unseemly in certain quarters, but there was a healthy debate around that. I was on the other side for a while, but then came around. But finally, we had enough information from the compound to, I think, verify, and we did a press briefing at the Pentagon, and we kind of outlined what happened during the operation, went through the intelligence case, and then showed some of what we had found, including the videos of bin Laden watching videos of bin Laden, and all the outtakes, and so forth. And I think that was pretty much enough confirmation that people needed to be persuaded. But then finally, there was how do we appropriately deal with the body? That was a whole discussion in and of itself. I don't know how many hours I spent in meetings on this during the planning phase. There were different ways, within Muslim tradition to appropriately lay the body to rest, and ultimately, of course, we decided to put the remains at sea in accordance with Islamic tradition. But that was another kind of, I never thought I'd be thinking about this kind of scenario that we had to work through.
One thing I always wondered, and that was not about this raid, but perhaps we all want, when we're on our beats, want to know how much access the public affairs officer has to the principal, and usually you can tell pretty quickly how much access that person has. How much of a struggle was it for you to get the access that you were comfortable with, both at CIA and at Pentagon, and also specifically on this particular case?
So, great question. And I don't know if this was just dumb luck or always the way it was, the agency in particular, but I had zero trouble getting access to information. I'm not sure why they would trust that people so quickly, at a place like CIA, but I felt like whether it was on a personnel matter or on an operational issue or on something sensitive in the intelligence world, that I pretty much got the straight scoop. And that was even on some of the tough things that involved some of the people I was asking. There was a scandal around the destruction of certain interrogation tapes when I was at the agency, and I had to contact those involved, and they were forthcoming. So I felt at CIA like I never really had the ball hid from me. At least I don't recall a major moment. I'm sure there were moments where, like, why are we talking to George Little about this? But people ask that, at cocktail parties too. So, and at the Pentagon, I actually found it slightly more difficult. I think because of the size of the agency. I would call over to the DoD budget office, and I'm hearing this, and what's the ground truth? I'm like, this doesn't feel very important at the end of the day. Lives are not at stake, but ooh, that's very sensitive information. That budget line item is highly protected. It's unclassified for official use only. Come on, guys. So I found it to be more of a struggle actually at the Pentagon. I think just because of maybe size and scale than at CIA, which, relatively speaking, is more of I don't want to overstate it, but more of it's a smaller agency. I can't say the real number, but it's smaller and more professional, family oriented, I think, in many respects. You had another question that I'm not, on the bin Laden raid? So I was surprised at how easy it was. Maybe it's because, I'd been there a while and it developed trust and so forth, but I got the full, I was sitting in the meetings where they were going around and talking about every detail, and people were assessing the percentage chance that it was bin Laden and so forth, and meeting with the NSA operators and so forth. So for whatever reason, there was really no problem with access at that stage. And I think that was in large part because I had very supportive bosses. Not all press secretaries, are fortunate enough to have bosses who respected the role and understood the role I had to play and trusted me to not dime out state secrets.
And I just had two questions. One, just curious because you brought this up.
Yeah.
What was your family's reaction, after having missed all the toddler school events and just life, and saying your cousin was a victim from 9/11. I imagine that there was a lot of happiness, but the fact that you were so close to it must have just been wild for your wife and family.
Yeah, it was emotional. I'll admit it. And her reaction, I can't necessarily convey all of it in polite company because I hadn't been a very good husband or father for a while. But at the end of the day, I think they got it, and I think they were proud that I had the privilege of being part of this. And by the way, thousands of people over the years had contributed to this. This wasn't one team at one moment in time, and this was a body of intelligence. So I think she understood. It took her a few weeks. I think she didn't realize that the president was going to give a speech on anything until Andrea Mitchell and Jim Lukashevsky at the time and others were calling my house, "Is George there? Is George there? Is George there?" And then she's like, "Oh, something must be going on." She couldn't reach me because in the White House Situation Room, you can't have, at the time, BlackBerries or iPhones or what have you. So she was wondering where I was. She knew it was probably work-related, but she forgave me fairly quickly, even though there were some tough conversations.
And then the other thing I was going to ask, just knowing that you're no longer in this role, but thinking about that happening in 2011 and it being 2024, Twitter, like you were saying, Twitter existed then, but I just can't imagine how much harder it would be to keep this under wraps now. I'm just curious if you think it would have been that much harder. You were saying you were sitting there on the edge of your seat all night at the White House Correspondents' Center and the weeks, months leading up to it. Obviously, there are things that are happening now that none of us are privy to and nobody is, but I just feel like it's getting harder to have things not leak, and I'm curious about your position on that.
Even when I was in government, I used to tell people at the agency or Pentagon who thought, "Oh, we can really keep this secret, blah, 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 it's never come out." I'm like, "Look, guys, this is Washington. And even if this is lawful, creative, the American people would support it, this is going to come out one day. It may not be tomorrow, but it's going to be in a few weeks or what have you." See the Bob Levinson story. It took several years, but it eventually came out. The media landscape, you're right, today is absolutely changed dramatically. I think what I worry about sometimes is not just people happening on to people practicing for bin Laden raids somewhere in the desert, right, and live tweeting it. It's actually sometimes our own people, not because they're trying to be malicious, but because they're taking a selfie in a certain place, or they're communicating in a certain way, or they're Facebooking, from a certain part of the world, or what have you. And if you're able to put the dots together, sometimes you can paint a picture of what's going on. Not always, but you can sniff that something is going on, and that will lead people to chase certain stories. So I think it is more complex these days. I'm not sure that I still have faith in the press corps, though. If there had been a leak, from to a reputable outlet, I really believe that no one would have gone with this story. Again, I would have had to promise a lot. But I think that core of journalism remains today. I really do.
Hi, Mike Pasoli with the AP.
Great.
You talk about planning before this raid, the possibilities of one way or the other, and all the work that goes into that. Do you feel like after it was said and done, working with the press, that you had prepared yourself as much as you could for the press coming at you, which I'm sure was a giant wave of attention?
It was a tsunami or two, yeah.
Yeah,
at least,
did you feel prepared, that you had prepared yourself adequately? Or was there anything you felt like you could have changed?
It's a great question. I honestly think that, and I'm sure we didn't bat 1,000, maybe, but having that plan and the classified intelligence case, which became unclassified once the raid was ended, was exceptionally helpful in describing the TikTok, of the raid planning itself, in describing the intelligence case and why we really thought it was bin Laden. We couldn't get into everything, of course, but I really do think it was helpful. Where I think we fell down, frankly, was after the raid a little bit. We could have taken a beat and said, let's get the details of the operation down a little more fully before we start, pontificating about what happened here or there, how many seconds, in the what floor was he on, all of those things that if you get it wrong can kind of erode credibility in the overall story. And there were some missteps there, frankly, which I think we could have done better. So if I had to do it all over again, I would have done more planning for the aftermath than the actual kind of pre-planning intelligence case. That's one thing I think it was a miss.
I'm curious, in your planning for potential leaks, what deals were you preparing to offer to
Any
the
and all,
reporters?
any and all.
Some examples.
I mean, I would have done anything from, an exclusive with the director. I would have brought in the lead on the operation on a no-names basis because they were undercover, right? I would have done a lot. I would have flown people to Afghanistan, to be with Admiral McRaven. I really would have. I'd have made a moment of it. There were, and I'd be willing to negotiate more in that case. I really would have.
Time for one more?
Sure.
Or maybe
I
two.
really appreciate you all listening to me.
Hi, I'm Sarah Fortinsky with The Hill. I'm curious about the moment that you were talking about earlier where you said that Nancy Pelosi called you liars and you had to push back and sort of how that miscommunication happened or those types of miscommunication, like what goes wrong there, and also to what extent it's up to you or the press secretary to determine the response, and to what extent is it like you just sort of have to take your cue from your bosses?
Great question. So there was actually, the disagreement was the Congress really briefed on this, or was there a little bit of a wink and a nod given to Congress that this was happening? And many members in Congress contended that while they were vaguely aware of certain things that the agency was doing, that there was not a full comprehensive report to them on the full nature of the enhanced interrogation program and the so-called secret prisons and rendition activities and so forth. And frankly, the agency did not have great records on those briefings either, and had to cobble them together kind of sort of in the moment when this flashpoint occurred. And that's all I could really rely on at the time was our own accounting based on real records. But, on this date in 2001 or 2 or whenever it was, we briefed so-and-so on this and there were no issues, But how can you really tell what the context of that conversation was 6 or 7 years prior, right? And how can you really rely on the record? So we were, I think, on our back foot because of our own record keeping, frankly, in that case. That being said, you really can't say no comment when your entire agency is being called a bunch of liars, right? And in that case, we were trying to do the right thing and get the right information together, and we really don't. It's not our policy or practice to lie to the American Congress. That's not a career-enhancing move, and it's not good for the agency. So had to push back, and honestly, I made the call at the time because I couldn't reach anybody, including my boss, because he was in some situation room meeting. And I just said, we're going to have to say this. So it's not our policy or practice to lie to the United States Congress. I wasn't taking issue with the particular facts surrounding congressional briefings and enhanced interrogation, but I was at least, making a broad statement about our integrity as an institution. I was really worried that my boss, very close to Nancy Pelosi, both California Democrats, would react to that. But he had my back at the end of the day. And I kind of knew he would. I wasn't entirely sure. This was probably my biggest public affairs fail ever. I felt terrible about this. He was famous for bringing his dog to work. I hadn't met Bravo yet, because he lived in California. He was coming back and forth. Bravo was finally coming to CIA. Beautiful, beautiful dog. He was being walked after the Christmas party, and reporters, because they're always there for the final booze and snacks, right? It was reporters and me, basically, and some saw the director walking his dog. I said, oh, that's Bravo. I haven't met him yet, and someone wanted to do a story on Bravo. A little feature piece, fine. Next morning, I am at the director's daily meeting. He turns down to look at me, tips his glasses like this, and says, George, I just want you to know that Bravo is a fucking golden retriever. I had told the reporter that it was an Irish setter. And I'm a dog guy. I went up to his office. I looked at pictures of Bravo. I consulted with his secretary. That is an Irish setter. That is not a golden retriever. I'm not sure he talked to me for a couple of days, my boss, because this dog, really important, and he also sat through all the briefings on the bin Laden raid. Didn't leak, by the way. And so the Washington Post had reported that he was a golden retriever. 2 weeks later, during the same meeting, I said, look, we need to bury the hatchet here on this. Here's a gift for you, sir. I passed it down in the same meeting. And he opened it, and I said, this is really for Bravo, but I wanted to get this to you before you head home to Monterey for Christmas. And it was a doggy T-shirt that I had printed, and it said, hello, my name is Bravo. I'm working undercover as an Irish setter. Fast forward a year, he's now at DOD, and DOD Christmas party, it's the secretary, the Pentagon press corps is there, same thing. Bravo comes through, reporter comes up to me and says, I want to do a little piece on Bravo. I said, fine. What's Bravo's breed? I said, Bravo is a golden retriever. A golden retriever. Please print that he's a golden retriever. The next morning I wake up, and in Politico, Bravo's an Irish setter. I called the reporter at 6:01. I said, I need a correction from you. Why? I said, well, he said, well, I did some fact checking. I went back to the Washington Post. I said, I got that wrong last year. Anyway, he did issue a correction, but that was perhaps my worst boss fail in the job. So.
Well,
I'm sorry, it was. Absolutely, believe me. Akela, if you want to do a piece on Bravo, he's dearly departed Bravo now, but he's a golden retriever, okay? Not an Irish setter, okay? Thank you.
well, thank you so much.
I appreciate it.